Klein. I'm the Alvin B. and Nancy Baird Curator for Historical Collections at the Claude Moore Health Sciences Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome each of you here today for what promises to be a very informative discussion afterwards and lecture proceeding. The topic today is the Type 2 Diabetes Crisis. Can history help us address it? Our speaker is Professor Arleen Tuchman, who is in the Department of History at Vanderbilt University. You can find more information about Professor Tuchman in your handout. This lecture today is co-presented with the History of the Health Sciences lecture series. We hear almost daily about the rapidly increasing rate of type 2 diabetes in the United States population. Many pronouncements are dire, proclaiming an epidemic, and almost make it sound as though this problem is relatively new, just 3 or 4 decades old. Yet, almost 100 years ago, a small group of U.S. health care professionals was already warning that diabetes was, quote, a public health problem, end of quote. Fated to become worse if nothing was done soon. But what did they mean by this? Why had they grown concerned? And what measures did they recommend to try and reverse the upward trend in the diabetes rates? In this Medical Center Hour, historian Arleen Tuchman asks what we can learn from history that might help us to better understand how we are framing the diabetes crisis today and why. How do cultural assumptions about diabetes and about the particular populations believed to be most at risk influence not only our understanding of the disease, but also our efforts to gain control over it? Join with me in welcoming Professor, I have to say first, Professor Tuchman has declared no financial conflict of interest. Now, welcome her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I like to always look at everyone in the audience, but I have to confess I'm feeling a little vertigo. So if I tend to look down most of the time, it's not because I don't like those of you in the back. So I would like to begin by thanking Joan Klein and Professors Luc Demaitre, Marcia Childress, and the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities for inviting me here today. I am delighted to have this opportunity to talk to you about my research on diabetes. This talk, and indeed a book I am writing on the cultural history of diabetes, are works in progress, and I welcome your questions and your comments at the end of my talk. So my guiding question today is what we can learn from history that might help us understand the way we are framing the diabetes crisis today. And so I want to take just a moment to explain why I've chosen the word frame. I build here on the work of Charles Rosenberg in the introduction to his co-edited book, Framing Disease. He talks about how what we label or diagnose as a disease is not a simple matter. In important ways, diseases don't exist until we agree that they do. That is, until they are named or until they are diagnosed. So in this way, he argues, diseases are social or cultural products. But they're not merely cultural products. So we may be comfortable insisting that the 19th century disease of masturbation or of neurasthenia were little more than cultural constructions. But we wouldn't be as comfortable talking about cholera or tuberculosis in this way. Still, they were both also laden with meaning. Cholera was believed to be a disease of ignorant, dirty Irish people. Tuberculosis sported a more refined image in the early 19th century, although by the end of the century, it was also seen to be a disease of the dirty urban poor. So by focusing attention on the question of how we are framing the diabetes crisis, I'm asking us to think about the meanings that we ascribe to the disease. What images does the disease evoke? What associations do we make with diabetes when we think of type 1 or when we think of type 2? Are certain populations considered to be more at risk than others? What explanations circulate about what is causing the disease? So in short, I'm interested in exploring the space between the material reality of the disease and what I like to call the stories we tell about who gets diabetes and why. So to do so, I'm going to take you back in time because I think we're too close to the stories that we tell today to recognize them as stories. So one caveat, my purpose today is not to offer my ideas on how we can best lower the incidence of diabetes. I am not an expert on that score. Chances are some or even many of you are in the trenches or will be in the trenches struggling with this problem daily. Rather, my intent is to use my skills as an historian to illuminate some aspects of the problem we are confronting in a way that might open up new possibilities. So the way I've structured my talk is to give you some very brief historical background information. I intended to give you more, but then I looked to see how long this talk would take, and it was going over an hour, and so this unfortunately is where I needed to do a lot of cutting. I will then turn to 3 ways in which diabetes has been framed. I'm going to spend most of my time on who we've framed as being at risk. And this is because this is the area of my work that I have spent the most time on so far. I'm then going to talk about the way in which diabetes has been framed as being linked to obesity, and also about why we talk about different types of diabetes. These are less developed, and in fact, in the Q&A, I would love to know whether you think those frames also work. I'm thinking of other frames as well that I might use in this book, and would love to know if there are any that come to mind for you. In each case, I'm going to start with history and then bring us up to the present. So, brief historical background. The word diabetes is from the Greek. It means siphon. We don't know who first used it, but the first detailed clinical description of the disease is attributed to Aretaeus of Cappadocia, a 2nd century Greek physician, who painted a horrifying picture of individuals with emaciated bodies, tortured by unquenchable thirst, and trapped in an endless cycle of excessive drinking and making water. He considered it fortunate that diabetes was, and I quote, not very frequent among mankind, end quote. The disease remained infrequent until the late 19th century, but then it began to attract attention. In the United States, census reports showed that the diabetes mortality rate had increased 150% between 1850 and 1900. Now, it didn't yet claim many lives. In 1900, it ranked 27th among all causes of disease. But no other disease was showing such exponential growth. Now, they were aware that in part this growth was because the population was aging, so that people were living long enough to develop the disease. But the incidence of diabetes was increasing faster than other diseases that afflicted the aged, like cancer and cardiovascular diseases. And this is what was worrisome. So what did they know about the disease at this time? It wasn't until 1889 and the research of 2 scientists at the University of Strasbourg that attention was shifted from the kidney to the pancreas as being the major organ that was implicated in the disease. And once Minkowski and von Mering did this research that implicated the pancreas, the search was on to look for what they believed was an internal secretion that was connected with the disease. This research finally led to the discovery of insulin in 1921, Many of you may know that until that time, treatment relied on diet, often almost starving the individual in order to remove sugar from the urine. And so insulin was hailed as this great miracle drug. And articles in newspapers hailed this new miracle. And many of you, I'm sure, have seen the classic pictures of the before and after, and I have just a few for you here. So people were looking in these magazines, they could see the body of the starved individual before insulin, and then the wonderfully plump, healthy young person after. This picture is the one that I enjoy the most because the miraculous nature of insulin is exaggerated through some pretty obvious photographic techniques. So the child is naked and then clothed. The child is being held by his mother, is sitting alone. You've got the camera coming up close, all of which is really emphasizing, and they want to say exaggerating a bit, the miraculous nature of insulin. Well, insulin was a miracle and it wasn't, because it did not cure the disease. And people who had insulin instead realized that they were entering a period of chronic illness and an ongoing battle to stave off complications such as renal failure, blindness, neuropathy, and a host of other problems. Insulin-dependent diabetics also now face the new risk of triggering hypoglycemic attacks, which could lead to coma and to death. Now, some of these problems were gradually addressed by new drugs, better insulins, and new medical technologies. But none of these cured diabetes, and more important for my talk today, none of them made an impact on increasing diabetes rates. So think of it this way. Insulin made a huge impact at the level of the individual, but at the level of the population, it made no measurable impact at all. By 1936, 15 years after insulin's discovery, diabetes had climbed to the 9th leading cause of death, from the 27th to the 9th in 36 years in the United States, and a conversation began about whether diabetes was, quote, a public health problem, right? This is the 1930s, not the 1980s. Now, we need to keep in mind that until this time, public health was almost only about infectious diseases. The goal in public health was to prevent initial infection, and if that wasn't successful, then to prevent the spread of infection. So what was new was this attempt to redirect the gaze of public health to chronic diseases. There's a whole interesting story that I don't have time to tell here, but there's an entire chapter on diabetes and eugenics, eugenics being the science of better breeding that Sir Francis Galton, who was a cousin of Charles Darwin, basically made popular in the late 19th century, and that really took off in this country in the 1920s. The story of diabetes and eugenics was part and parcel of increased interest in preventing chronic diseases that were believed to be hereditary. And actually, the chronic disease that attracted most attention was the quote-unquote disease or condition of feeble-mindedness, but there was a whole conversation about diabetes as well. In trying to redefine diabetes as a public health problem, the advocates emphasized two things. One was the increasing financial burden, which diabetes shared with other chronic diseases. But what made diabetes distinct in the eyes of these public health officials was their conviction that diabetes was preventable. All that was necessary was education. Well, I would say that's where we are today to a great extent. We're convinced we have a disease that is preventable, yet we have been frustratingly unable to stop its upward trend. A few weeks ago, a report commissioned by the American Diabetes Association made headlines everywhere when it claimed that, quote, the total estimated cost of diagnosed diabetes in 2012 is $245 billion. That marked a 41% increase since 2007, but not because more money was being spent per person. This was because of increasing numbers. And even if we could talk about how numbers can be massaged, we're all very sophisticated statisticians today, it's pretty clear that what we have been doing is not working. The problem is not only in the United States. Diabetes is a worldwide problem, and not only in developed countries, but also in developing countries. But my comments today all focus on the United States. So what I'd like to do now is turn to the ways that we frame the disease, and I want to start with who is at risk. So historically speaking, there have been stark changes here. In the late 19th, early 20th century, when diabetes was first believed to be a serious problem, it was considered largely a disease of the middle class, and the population thought to be most at risk were the Jews. This idea originated in Europe, where since about the 1870s, physicians were publishing papers claiming that Jews died of diabetes at a rate 2 to 6 times higher than the rest of the population. And in the German languages, diabetes even became known as the Judenkrankheit, the Jewish disease. This belief was widespread in the United States as well. I'm going to give you one example, although I could give you many. Dr. J. Wilson, who was a physician with the United States Public Health Service, who was stationed at Ellis Island in the early 20th century. He observed people like this coming into the country. I always look for an opportunity to, the title is removed. These are my great-grandparents. When I first saw this picture, I was convinced that this was from the shtetl in the old country in Belarus. It's actually from 1935, the Lower East Side, but you may as well still have been in Belarus. Wilson was studying the tripling of the diabetes rate in New York City between 1889 and 1910, and he insisted that the reason for this tripling was the influx of Eastern European Jews. And so he produced this, oh, there they are. I guess I had them twice. He produced this graph that showed the influx of Eastern European Jews set against the increase in the diabetes rate. And for Wilson, this correlation was enough to convince him of causation. Every time I see this graph, I think of this cartoon that I saw in the New Yorker, and I found it as I was preparing for this lecture. At the same time, as the belief was widespread that Jews were most at risk for developing diabetes, there was a widespread conviction that blacks were immune. One physician, writing in JAMA in 1904, said, and I quote him, "I have never seen a case of diabetes in Negroes, nor could I find another practitioner who had done so." So, was there any truth to this differential susceptibility? And I want to say, possibly, but we need to be very cautious. We need to be cautious because data from that time is not reliable. Most articles that claimed there was a connection did not provide statistics, and those that did drew on experiences with select populations, whether it was a physician talking about his own practice or the hospital where he practiced. Populations with little contact with the official medical community were also not recorded. So does this mean it was all a fabrication? And again, I want to say not necessarily. We know from recent studies that populations that move from places of deprivation to places of abundance often experience increasing diabetes rates, and perhaps this is what was happening with the Eastern European Jews. It's also possible that the Jewish population was more overweight than other populations. Physicians at the time were already linking diabetes with being overweight, and many certainly thought that the Jews as a population weighed more than other populations, but they also acknowledged that no one had done a study to determine whether or not that was accurate. Still, even if there are some truths to these claims, it would not help us understand the meanings ascribed to the disease. And this is where the importance of framing comes into play. Framing diabetes as a Jewish disease led professional and popular writers alike to wonder, what was it about the Jews that put them at risk? And the answers ranged from heredity to temperament to lifestyle. So our Dr. Wilson at Ellis Island blamed it on, and I quote, some hereditary defect. William Osler, the very famous clinician, blamed it on Jews, particularly, and I quote, neurotic temperament. Think Woody Allen. Well, he didn't think Woody Allen, but we can. Haven Emerson, professor of preventive medicine at Columbia's College of Physicians and Surgeons, implied that it was the gluttony and the greed of the Jews that put them at risk. Others shied away from racial explanations. Elliot Joslin, by far the most famous diabetes specialist in this country in the first half of the century, insisted that the Jew did not develop diabetes because he was a Jew, but, and I quote him, because he's fat. So there was a hodgepodge of explanations, some built on the popular belief that Jews were a separate race. Some didn't engage with the racial status of the Jews at all. Some were anti-Semitic, and others were not. What's particularly noteworthy, and what totally complicates this picture, is that Jewish physicians also believed that Jews were at high risk for this disease. And I'm convinced that to understand this, we need to recognize that the language surrounding diabetes was not all negative. There were positive images that circulated as well, and Jewish physicians made reference to these. Diabetes was considered one of the diseases of civilization. Diseases of civilization, diabetes wasn't the only one, were so called because in more industrialized nations, and industrialized meant at that time more civilized, the mortality rate among infants and children had been so far reduced that people were living long enough to develop the diseases of old age. But diabetes was also considered a disease of civilization because the disease itself, and I should mention this is also true of angina, the disease itself was associated with traits considered to be markers of more advanced races. Listen, for example, to Dr. Emil Klein, whose book on diabetes mellitus and glycosuria was translated from its original German into English in 1900 and was a widely used textbook. I quote him, "With greater intellectual exertion, keener emotions, higher nervous development, more earnest struggle for existence, more urgent demands, and a more intense culture, we are bound to find more diabetes mellitus." The Darwinian reference is explicit. The very traits that ensure that one will succeed in the struggle for existence also produces diabetes. To suffer from diabetes marked one as more advanced than other peoples. The link between Jews and diabetes continued through the 1930s and 1940s. It began to thin out in the 1950s, and it was basically gone by the 1960s. Why? Well, it's possible that changing diets, socioeconomic status, and even aesthetics contributed to the decline, but I have not found any articles that addressed that point. Another possibility is that Jews were no longer considered to be a separate race. This is also a very long story that I don't have time for here. Suffice it to say that by the 1940s, Jews had been turned, in the words of one historian, into white folk. And it's also possible that following the Holocaust, so this would certainly be for the late 1940s and 1950s, it became more difficult to talk about Jewish diseases. One of the exceptions, of course, would be Tay-Sachs, but Tay-Sachs was a very different kind of disease than diabetes, which was wrapped up with these characterological assumptions about the Jewish people. Still, talk about race and diabetes did not disappear. During the next several decades, awareness grew slowly that diabetes was a problem in African American and Native American communities. Now, I'm still working out the story about Native Americans, but in African American communities, a small group of physicians had actually been trying since the late 1920s and early 1930s to draw attention to increasing rates in that community. This included physicians at Tulane, at Johns Hopkins, and at Emory, among others. But they were unable to penetrate the dominant conversation or the dominant discourse. In 1942, frustrated, the African-American pathologist Julian Herman Lewis tried to draw attention to this research. He lambasted the medical community for continuing to insist that blacks had a relative immunity to this disease, despite the growing evidence that it was a problem in these communities as well. And he also couldn't make any impact. So 5 years later, right, he makes this complaint in 1942. 5 years later, in 1947, the United States Public Health Service decided it needed to know more about the burden of diabetes in this country. And particularly, it wanted to know what the extent might be of individuals who had diabetes and didn't know it. That is, what's the burden of the undiagnosed? So the United States Public Health Service decided they were going to do a community study, and they looked around for a town that would be representative of towns in this country, and they decided on Oxford, Massachusetts. Town of about 5,000 people. They tested 70% of the population, and they found that for every 4 people who were diagnosed with diabetes, 3 were undiagnosed. This was deeply troubling. Oxford, Massachusetts was and remains a largely white population. So even the way in which Jews always talk with their hands. Even the way in which they imagined, or what I want to say is the way that they imagined the at-risk population shaped the population that they then went on to study. So one consequence of the way that diabetes had been framed was to render invisible some communities where diabetes was also a problem, which clearly delayed efforts at intervention in ways that may very well have led to some of the problems we are facing today. But there's another consequence that I want to focus on, and that's the way at-risk populations have most often been defined around the categories of race and ethnicity. I used history to draw our attention to the problems that arose from the conviction that Jews were most at risk. What I want to do now is jump to how we are framing diabetes today. Already by the 1980s, minority populations were being defined as most at risk, right? Diabetes favors minorities. This is a poster from the American Diabetes Association. It does not have a date, but I am pretty sure, based on other things that I know about this period, that this is a poster from the 1980s. I had to remove some other pictures in the interest of time. So what I'd like to do is to jump now to government websites which also define minority populations as being most at risk. So here is a table based on data that is available at the website of the National Institute for Diabetes and Digestive and Kidney Diseases, which is one of the National Institutes of Health. Total prevalence of diabetes by race and ethnicity among people aged 20 years or older. And For all of you who are following diabetes, this is very familiar information. As a racial or ethnic group, non-Hispanic whites have the lowest prevalence, and the highest is among American Indians and Alaska Natives. So does this reflect what is going on in these communities? Well, yes. And no. Yes, there is different prevalence in different ethnic and racial communities, although this leaves open the question of why. There's lots of debate here. Is it genes? Is it because of genes or some other heredity? Is it lifestyle choices? Although what does choice mean if we're talking about people who live with limited resources? Is it food deserts? Is it some combination of all of these? Rather than weighing in on this debate, I want to focus on a different question. And this is where my answer would be no. The chart is not an accurate representation of prevalence of diabetes in these populations. And that's because we have to ask why we have chosen to talk about differential susceptibility in terms of these particular groups. In what ways do these groupings make sense? And I ask because it's not difficult to find further breakdown of data, not when you go to these sites per se, but if you just look into race, ethnicity, and diabetes, it's not difficult to find further breakdown of data that shows that some of these groups mask great diversity. So the 16.1% of American Indians and Alaska Natives actually masks a range from 5.5% among Alaska Natives to 33.5% among American Indian adults in southern Arizona. The 11.8% among Hispanic Latino Americans ranges from 7.6% among Cuban Americans to 13.8% of Puerto Ricans. So I would say we already have two questions. If there's so much diversity within these groups, what sense do these groups make if we're trying to understand differential susceptibility? And why is it so difficult to find data that differentiate the other groups, like non-Hispanic blacks or non-Hispanic whites? And I ask because we know about very high rates of diabetes in Appalachia, or some of you may say Appalachia. You can find local studies, and they tend to show a prevalence of about 12% of the population. So I expanded my original chart to come up with this. I still have a ways to go before I master graphs and PowerPoint. What I imagine this would be showing you is a far cry from what's up there. But let me just say that what I have up here are the total percentages that appeared in the last graph, but then I put in the breakout numbers, and to show you which groups belong together, like Alaska Natives, American Indians and Native Alaskans, American Indians in southern Arizona, they're all red. And then the blue belongs together, so non-Hispanic whites, but then Appalachia, and so on. So the groups of the same color are the same ethnic or racial group. And clearly, it's all over the map. So what's my point? I would say, and please disagree with me in the Q&A, that these groups make no sense if we're trying to understand differential prevalence of diabetes in different populations in the United States. And my concern is that by organizing data according to racial and ethnic groups, that we are encouraged to think that there's something about these groups that make them either susceptible or relatively immune. That's certainly what we saw with Jews and with African Americans in the past, and given our current fascination, obsession, choose your word, with genetics, the tendency is for us to also look for something biological. So my central message here is that the kind of data that we collect and how we organize it, and not necessarily the actual distribution of the disease, informs how we visualize diabetes, how we visualize those who suffer from diabetes, and how we try and intervene. Okay, so I'm going to move to my second frame, which is the link to obesity. There's nothing new about positing a link between diabetes and obesity. In the late 19th century, one physician already called this association, and I quote, an old established fact. I should mention that at the time, they did not have the language of type 1 and type 2. In fact, they believed all diabetes was basically the same disease, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when I turn to my third frame. They did recognize, however, that diabetes was unusually severe when it developed in the young, and that it was much milder when it manifested in someone who was older. And they also recognized that obesity was more of a problem among those who had the milder form. That said, there was far less judgment about obesity. Physicians were far more likely to simply identify obesity as one of many risk factors and then move on to recommended treatments. And I would argue that this was in part because the meaning of fat was still complex. It had once been a symbol of wealth, of health, and of sexuality, and that was not totally gone. One piece of evidence is this painting by Renoir from 1918 that captures still that older association of fat with health and sexuality. But even as this painting appeared, changes were underway. And by the 1920s, we see a language of blame and shame beginning to surface. Indeed, Elliot Joslin captured this new attitude in 1921 when he referred to diabetes, and I quote him, as a penalty of obesity. Joslin was interested in strategies for prevention, and he was convinced that his colleagues would be more successful with their diabetes patients if they shamed them into losing weight. Stop using polite terms, he told them. Instead of saying, "You're a trifle obese," tell them you're too fat. Indeed, Joslin's prediction was that, and I quote him, in the next generation, one may be almost ashamed to have diabetes. The new meaning of fat that Joslin was drawing on and reproducing became symbolic of an individual's failure to exercise self-control. As a historian, we so believe this today, it's really odd for us to realize that this developed at a particular moment in time. As historian Peter Stearns has argued, at a time in our history when consumer culture was taking off, fat became a secular sin, and maintaining a slim body became a moral imperative. Some physicians were even concerned that insulin was being used as, and I quote, an easy way out of the consequences of dietary sins, end quote. Haven Emerson believed that the best cure for individuals who were, quote, overeating themselves into fatness and as a result into their graves was not insulin, but individual education and self-control. The judgments, the harshness, they're palpable, but in an interesting twist, diabetes was seen not only as evidence of rampant consumerism and out-of-control behavior, but also as a possible antidote. Because the successful management of the disease demanded a strict discipline that could restore one to a life of moderation, which would presumably also lead one to lose weight. Joslin even referred to diabetics once as apostles of food hygiene, because no one better than they could teach others about the harm and excess of weight. Other writers claimed diabetics made better citizens than the average. The author of an article on diabetes in a popular magazine insisted that diabetics, and I quote her, are never wasters and drunkards because they have to learn early in their disease to be controlled and self-reliant. They have greater intelligence than the average, and they develop it by constant use. Of course, she added, there undoubtedly have been diabetics with weak characters, but they didn't live very long to tell their tale. Out of control versus restrained, wasters and drunkards versus food apostles, fat, indulgent diabetics with weak character versus those who successfully managed their disease. The moral judgments were not hidden. Diabetics made good citizens. It was a disease that could be put in service to the nation. And it really proliferated actually during World War II. No one, however, saw these different characteristics as distinguishing type 1 and type 2 diabetics. So instead of wrapping up this section, I want to segue right into my third frame, because much of what I want to say about the judgments we have today tie in with how we have divided these diseases into type 1 and type 2. So there was some talk as early as the 1930s that all the different manifestations of diabetes might be separated out into different types. But nothing really came of it until 1979, when the medical community officially distinguished between insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, which was seen thereafter as type 1, and non-insulin-dependent diabetes mellitus, which was shortly thereafter called type 2. The former, which I grew up calling juvenile diabetes, I know you all know is believed to be an autoimmune disease which attacks the beta cells of the pancreas, rendering the body incapable of producing insulin. And the second, which I grew up calling adult onset, has a more obscure pathology, but it is marked by the tissue's resistance to insulin. These are, of course, only the most common forms. There's also gestational diabetes. There's latent autoimmune diabetes of adults, which is sometimes called type 1.5. There's maturity onset diabetes of the young. This proliferation of types suggests, of course, that the definitions that were laid down in 1979 do not fully capture the complex clinical picture of diabetes, and in fact, some are beginning to wonder whether these distinctions make sense. But what interests me most is the cultural work that has been and is being performed by dividing diabetes up in this way. And so in interest of time, I want to put it bluntly. The complex messages that circulated around diabetes in the past that cast it both as a symbol of indulgence and as a symbol of citizenship are being parsed out. In this story, those with type 1 are good or innocent, and those with type 2 are bad or guilty or responsible for their disease. I wish I had time to really deconstruct this. If you have questions, we can come back to it in the Q&A. And what I love about this is it picks up on Emerson's concern about insulin being used as an excuse that allows one to continue with the indulging sin. I'm not saying things were better when the messages were complex. I think it's necessary for us to be sensitive to and aware of all the messages. But the parsing of messages I find very troubling. And one place where the contrast has become particularly evident is in articles that address tensions between the two populations of type 1 and type 2. Articles have titles like the type 1 versus type 2 diabetes war, diabetes civil war, or wanted, a new name for type 1 diabetes. As the last title suggests, much of the anxiety stems from those with type 1 diabetes who worry about being swallowed up by the massive attention being focused on type 2. And their concerns are many, and some of the loudest advocates for type 1 are parents of children who have type 1. They're concerned that so much attention is being focused on type 2 that type 1 is being eclipsed, that funding that has been earmarked for type 1 might be diverted to type 2, And they worry that they and their children are being tainted by the negative images associated with type 2. One mother of a 4-year-old said, "People think diabetes is about being fat. My daughter isn't fat. She's beautiful. I mean, just look at that contrast and then think of the Reuben. I wish it had a different name," she added. Or this athlete with type 1. "I really find it hard to take seriously the complaints of type 2 diabetics who, in my view, brought this on themselves. With type 1 diabetes, there's absolutely nothing tied to my lifestyle, and this is something over which I had absolutely no control. But people sometimes suggest that it's because I ate too much sugar or something, and that drives me crazy." Now, I would argue there are lots of problems with describing type 2 in this way. The close link with fat is problematic. Most people who are overweight do not have type 2 diabetes, but we've gotten to a point where we almost make that assumption if someone is overweight that they are automatically at risk. Some people who have type 2 are not fat. And recent research suggests that being overweight, and I don't mean obese, but being overweight may actually be healthier, not than being thin, we've heard that, but may actually be healthier than being of normal weight. There's also a problem with this whole notion of choice. For one, heredity appears to play an important role in type 2, meaning not everything is about choice, but choice is a really complicated concept. Lifestyle choices, at the very least, are complicated by available resources. And so we do need a more sophisticated way of thinking about that concept. So I want to close by saying that in important ways, diabetes today is doing similar cultural work to what it did in the interwar years. It is still a metaphor for overindulgence, gluttony, and lack of self-control. Here's my cartoon. It still embodies the anxieties of a society now in the advanced stages of consumer culture. At the same time, the image of diabetes is changing. Once a disease of wealth, of Jews, and of complex messages about self-control and citizenship, it's turning into a disease of people of color and the poor. No one writes any longer about diabetics as agents of change or apostles of food hygiene. No wonder people with type 1 are anxious. But I have to say, we are burdening both them and those with type 2 diabetes with messages that may say more about our anxieties than they say about the disease. Thank you. And I can't imagine you don't have questions and comments.
And we have plenty of time for questions. Please wait till the microphone comes to you, and when it does, identify yourselves. Thank you.
I'm Al Rogel. I'm a pediatric endocrinologist here. Thank you for a wonderfully different point of view of diabetes, of what we as peds endos or endos do. One of the things that seems to have compressed in time is a new disease, and that is called cystic fibrosis-related diabetes. Never heard of it before. When I was an intern 40 years ago, kids lived to 5 or 6 and they died. It's a new disease. It's a community that is very, very up to date, and there may be some messages in that particular disease that would inform you about some of these other things. So that might be worthwhile looking into, ma'am.
Could I ask you, could you just give me like a teaser?
Sure. The pancreas is involved.
More of a teaser?
The problem with cystic fibrosis-related diabetes is that the pancreas, both its exocrine and its endocrine function, are compromised. The exocrine first, so you can't digest food. Then it becomes fibrosed, cystic fibrosis, and they get diabetes a different variety. It's not type 1, it's not type 2. About age 12, our groups who deal with this say that everybody around age 12 ought to start to be tested for it. But it's quite a different disease. It's treated very differently. Can you imagine a diabetic told that you got to eat as much fat as you possibly can? That's just not heard of for either type 1 or type 2. But there's an awful lot of sociology involved in this. There are many very, very good data, because the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation in the United States is very careful about that. And there is a pediatric endocrinologist in Minnesota by the name of Antoinette Moran, and you can look in the literature and find her name. But I do think, other than, never mind from your point of view how I or my colleagues might treat it, but I think with your thesis of frames, that might be actually another frame.
Great, thank you very much.
Anyone else? We've certainly been given a good bit to think on today.
I would even love just your reactions, honestly. Do these frames sound convincing? Are there other frames that you thought of? Do you think this is all hogwash?
I'm Bob Chevalier in pediatrics, and I'm wondering what you think of the Barker hypothesis with respect to the misalignment of the current plenty of fat and carbohydrate diet versus our Pleistocene inheritance that programs many of us to hang on to fat and salt. Some groups more than others, the Pima Indians, for example. So you ended your discussion on the view of type 2 diabetes in our current culture, which was predominantly sociologic, that it was a disease of people of color and the poor. Yet we now have all this emphasis on the genome and get your own genes exposed, and an emphasis also on genetic background, which harks back to the eugenics movement.
Right.
So how does it shake out?
Yeah, so let me just make sure I'm on the same wavelength. So I'm thinking thrifty genes. Is this what you're...
Correct.
Okay,
50
okay.
genes, right.
Yeah, so there's actually quite a lot of literature looking at the whole concept of the thrifty gene, and that questions its validity. But I think even if it's accurate, so just to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about, the population in the United States that has the highest prevalence of diabetes are the Pima Indians. And a geneticist by the name of James Neal came up with this concept of thrifty gene, I think it was back in the 1950s or the 1960s. And what he was arguing is that populations that experienced alternating times of plenty and scarcity would have been selected, there would have been selective pressure to be efficient fat stores. And that when these populations then end up in an environment where they're no longer, there's no longer scarcity, there's just plenty all the time, being efficient fat stores is detrimental, and they are going to put on weight much more quickly than other populations, and that may be what's going on with the Pima Indians. I've come across some research that is trying to apply this to African Americans, and this is actually part of my concern and goes back to the grouping. So even if it works for the Pima, their sister tribe never left Mexico, and they have no diabetes, so it doesn't mean that there isn't potentially a genetic contribution, but it's clear that if one lives in an environment where one is encouraged to encouraged to adopt a healthy lifestyle, and where the environment facilitates that lifestyle, then they won't develop diabetes. And so my whole point here would be, where are we focusing our attention, and why, given that we know that it's a lifestyle issue, although I like to remove the notion of choice from lifestyle. That's just my perspective. Why are we focusing so much attention on genetics? But I think if you start talking about looking for a thrifty gene in the African American community, I mean, it is not a single genetic pool. And that's my concern, that this fascination with the genetics is leading us to ask, what is it about this population? And that's where I think knowing about what's going on in Appalachia just throws all of this out, because we don't talk about there being a genetic reason there. That's all lifestyle. And so it really tells us about the way that we group populations more than it is telling us about actual populations and links with prevalence.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Your last chance for interaction.
I'm curious if anybody's
Could
looking
you
at...
identify yourself?
Robert Graham from the ophthalmology department. And we see a lot of diabetic patients. I'm curious if anybody's looking at the aspect of people having more hunger and eating more because they're getting less minerals in their diet. So if you're not getting the minerals you need, you've got to keep eating and eating. And I don't know whether it's partly due to demineralization of the soil, but I think you pointed out, everybody's pointed out that any populations that go from a sort of a traditional culture to a more modern culture, they all tend to get much more diabetes. And is anybody looking at?
I really don't know. I have not come across that, although there's an enormous amount of work that looks at the food industry and marketing of, not only the marketing of unhealthy foods, but we were actually just talking about this earlier today, the science that goes into making sure that you crave unhealthy foods. Mm-hmm. So the chemistry of unhealthy foods that always keep you from being satisfied. And there's a lot of work on that. I'm not familiar. It doesn't mean it's not going on. I'm just not familiar with what you're suggesting.
I wanted to call your attention and hope you join us next week. And be aware, it will be on Thursday instead of the usual Wednesday. And it will be held in the Claude Moore Med Ed building in the auditorium. So same time, 12:30 to 1:30, but in the Med Ed building auditorium. And on Thursday, the topic is Humanism as Activism, Preparing Future Champions in the New Medicine. Now please join with me in thanking Professor Tuchman.